Implications of the laws of thermodynamics. First of all, we have to realize that just using proven physical laws of chemistry and physics, using what science has proven to such an extent that it's actually merited the position of a law, something that whenever it's tested, no matter how often, no matter by who, we always get the same result. When we're using pristine pure science like the laws of thermodynamics, which Einstein said would never be overthrown by the advance of science, you would think that it would be an open and shut case. You would think, well, the evolutionists would just fall over dead in front of these overwhelming, unassailable scientific facts. But there is a problem you have to be apprised of. Whenever you debate, whenever you witness to someone, whenever you just have a conversation with an evolutionist, you have to really cut through a big smokescreen. You have to cut through a big premise they have that is not correct, is not logical, is not legitimate. But you have to point that out to them and pray the Holy Spirit will help them to grasp that, because they start with a premise that basically says no matter if all the evidence is against evolution and all of it appears to support intelligent design, creation is religion by definition and evolution is science, therefore we must go with science. And evolution wins anyway. So when we're dealing with origins, we're dealing with an emotional question. Whenever we deal with the question, who are we? Why are we here? What is our purpose and meaning and value in life? How do we determine what is right and what is wrong? And what is going to happen to us when we die? These questions really are tied up in the issue of our origin. If we're just mechanistic products of a mindless universe, then there really isn't any right and wrong. And when we ask the deep questions, who am I, why am I here, where am I going, the answer is, well, you're a nothing and a nobody, and you're not here for any real reason. You happen by chance, and when you die, that's it. You will rot back into plant fertilizer, and that'll be the end of you, and you'll never be conscious again, because evolution is purely materialistic, purely naturalistic. So it's an emotional question. Many people want to believe in God because such a belief, if true, offers a lot. Meaning, purpose, value, dignity, hope beyond the grave, the possibility of an eternal love relationship with an infinite being who loves us with a perfect love, the best of all possible worlds for eternity, if the God of the Bible is true and if his gospel is true. So many people, understandably, would prefer to believe that. And many evolutionists say, well, it's pie in the sky by and by. You're believing something because it sounds good and you'd like to believe it. But there are also people, such as our beloved evolutionists, who, when they're thoroughgoing evolutionists, they really don't want to believe in a God. That means there's somebody bigger and smarter than they are. Believe it or not, that bothers some people. They think they have a corner on all the knowledge. They think their intellect is the highest in the universe. They don't want somebody infinitely superior to them. And they certainly don't want such a powerful being to have the right to judge them for how they ran their life. That's a big issue. To them, that's their worst nightmare. That's the reality they hope is not true. And unfortunately, as the scripture tells us in Romans chapter 1, when men knew God, but they would not honor him as God, God's judgment on them was he turned them over to a reprobate mind. And although they profess to be wise, and although they may be wise in the things of the world, having multiple Ph.D.s, they miss the boat because they miss the most important truth the human heart can embrace. If there is a God who made us, that is the purpose and meaning and destiny of our existence. And if you miss that, what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? So it's an emotional question. Also, it's an unprovable question because ultimately we cannot repeat history in the laboratory. The origin of the universe, the origin of life, the alleged evolution of an ape-like creature into a man, these make nice stories, but when it comes to scientific proof, we cannot repeat any history in a laboratory. It only operates in the present. Now, approaching the question properly, and by that I mean agree to use fair rules when you get into this discussion. And what do I mean by that? Don't allow them to define science in a self-serving way that makes them winners by definition. No matter what you say, no matter what evidence you present, they can say, well, sorry, the rule book says I win and you lose anyway. Now here we have, well, let's see, a quote from Richard Lewontin in his article, Billions and Billions of Demons, New York Review. He said that we're forced, not by science, but by our a priori adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation. In other words, the rules of the investigation are such, and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, in other words, no matter how apparently illogical or irrational, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Why? Because we can prove that there is no God? No. No scientist can prove there is no God. To prove that there is no God, you would have to be everywhere present to make sure he's not hiding somewhere in the universe, which means you'd have to be omnipresent, and you'd have to be knowledgeable of every fact that exists everywhere in the entire universe. Omnipresent and omniscience, those are characteristics of an infinite God. And you'd have to have those characteristics to prove that there is no God. But if you did have them, you would qualify as God. Therefore, you would be God. God would exist, and it's a self-refuting logical argument. You can't prove a universal negative unless you have universal knowledge, which they do not have, and science does not have. So why can't they allow a divine foot in the door? The answer is because they jolly well don't want it. Philosophically, it is unpalatable to them. Now, we live in a free country. Under the U.S. Constitution, First Amendment, you can believe anything you want. You can even believe things that are stupid, and it's legal. Isn't that a wonderful thing about the U.S.? It's legal to believe in stupid things, but that doesn't make them true. That doesn't make them science. And if they want to believe this, I will defend their right in our free country, under our Constitution, to believe that if they want to as their religion, but they don't have the right to define it as science. Just because somebody supposedly died, some potentate died and left them the authority to redefine science. It doesn't quite work that way. Now, this definition of religion I love from Random House College Dictionary, a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. Materialism, naturalism, is the presupposition without possibility of proof by the scientific method that the whole of reality is naturalism. There is no supernatural dimension. There certainly is no supernatural creator. It is a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe that says it's all materialistic. It's all naturalistic. That is a religion. And as Brother Riddle pointed out so well, we already have a religion. We already have a faith. We don't need theirs. And we need to point out to them that what they have really is a faith. You know, if they want to be honest and say, I have this faith I'd like to share with you, I say, fine, I can understand that. But just don't call your faith science if it doesn't qualify as it. Don't mislabel it and expect me to accept that definition because it's just not correct. It's not true. Now, here I quote this famous quote by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, often quoted by the greatest evolutionist of the 20th century, at least arguably so, Theodosius Dobzhansky. And he was fond of quoting this, and it says, evolution is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. That is what evolution is. Now, this is really one of the most astounding quotes I've ever confronted. Right at the beginning, it admits it's nothing but a general postulate. That's another word for a hypothesis. Not even something that's been proved, just something that people conjure up in their imagination and say, well, we can test it, but we don't know if it's true yet. But somehow this mere postulate or hypothesis has the power to say all world systems must bow before it. And you know what? If you don't stop and say, wait a minute, you don't have the authority to do that, they'll run right over you and say, hey, Theodosius Dobzhansky, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin say so. So, what is it about their names that makes them right? Dropping names doesn't determine truth. And if it's just a postulate, it has to go through what every other postulate has to go through, proof by the scientific method. That has not happened for evolution. So I like to know what happened to the classic definition of science. The classic definition of science is the search for truth, whatever that truth may be. And the truth just may be that naturalism doesn't work, that nature, by her laws of chemistry and physics, did not create us and was not responsible for our origin. That may be the truth. And real science is interested in finding the truth, whatever the truth may be. It doesn't start by defining, well, we're not going to look in this area. It might be true, we can't prove it's not true, but we're not going to look in that area, and we're going to define that area as non-scientific by definition. namely supernatural creation. Guess what? Supernatural creation just might be true, and science can't prove it isn't true. So here we have the Orwellian thought police coming along and saying, look, you can search for truth, but only how and where we tell you to. See, everybody says, oh, we want to be free, we want freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And yet some of the greatest bondage in academia is this false definition of science that says you can only search for truth where we tell you to search and how we tell you to search. We need to call them on the carpet about that. So science, when redefined as materialism, says you may search for truth, but only where and how we tell you. Only materialistic explanations are allowed. Now the problem. What is the problem? When you allow your opponent to define the rules of argument, you lose. If they get to set the definition, guess what? They're always going to define the rules in such a way that no matter what happens, they win and you lose. For example, the first rule, since I get to set the rules, you've conceded me that right. I set the rules and you don't. That's the first rule. Okay? Then what's the second rule? Heads I win, tails you lose. Okay? So when your opponent is allowed and conceded the authority to define science in a self-serving manner, he controls the rule book. You're never going to win in that situation. It doesn't matter if in a football game you score all the touchdowns, or in a basketball game you get all the hoops. If the rule book says you lose by definition, it doesn't matter. And that's literally the position the evolutionists have put themselves in. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what evidence the evolutionists or the creationists have. It doesn't matter what arguments they have. We have real science on our side. Says who? Their own self-serving definition. We've got to take that away from them. They don't have the authority. Nobody died and bequeathed to them the right to change the classic definition of science, which is the search for truth, whatever that truth may be. So the conclusion, the search for truth's own sake, is unimportant, according to their definition. The only thing that matters is that a materialist victory is assured by controlling the definition of science, quote unquote, so that no matter what, they have to win, by definition. Now, it literally doesn't matter if all the evidence supports intelligent design and contradicts naturalistic evolution. You say, well, it's not that extreme, is it? It is. I quote here Dr. Scott Todd, an immunologist at Kansas State University, and he wrote this in Nature magazine. He said, even if all the data, notice all means all, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. End of quote. Now, what would they do if creationist scientists got up and said, even if all the data point to Darwinian evolution as being true, such an hypothesis is, not science because it's not supernaturalistic? Why, they'd scream and cry, and oh my goodness, you'd think the world would end. But we're supposed to put up with that. They wouldn't tolerate it for 1 second. But we're supposed to be so meek and mild, we'll let them get away with this illogic. And we have to put our foot down and say, look, we're willing to discuss, we're willing to talk, we're willing to debate, but let's level the playing field. Let's not start with a definition that guarantees that you win no matter what, because you define yourself as a victor by how you define the word science. So is it science or just philosophical bias? I quote here the eminent evolutionist of the early 20th century, D.M.S. Watson. He said, evolution is a theory universally accepted not because it can be proved by logically coherent evidence to be true, but because the only alternative, special creation, is clearly incredible. So it's not what we can prove that counts, it's what we don't like that counts. Why is creation incredible? Because you can prove it's unscientific? Because you can prove it didn't happen? No. Well, then maybe it did happen. Oh, no, it's incredible. How do you know? Well, because we don't like it. And we'll define what is credible and rational based on what we prefer. Really? I thought we lived in a democracy where people can believe what they want and search for truth the way they want, you see. And that's the point we have to bring out. Everybody's for democracy. Everybody's for freedom of thought. And we need to point out Orwell has had his heyday with this type of science because they suppress freedom of thought under their definition. It's incredible by definition, even though they can't prove it's wrong. I quote here Sir Arthur Keith, another crusading evolutionist of the early 20th century. He said, "Evolution is unproved and unprovable." Amen, brother? I would agree. We believe it because the only alternative is special creation, which is unthinkable. In other words, we're not believing in it because we can prove it, we can't. It's just because the alternative is so distasteful, so unpalatable, so reprehensible, that we'd rather believe anything than believe that. Well, it's a free country. You can choose what you prefer to believe, but you don't have the right to say that belief system is science by definition. Now, this quote just about blows me away. By the way, the full references for these quotes are found in my book out there, Evolution on Trial, with evolutionists at the witness stand. But L.T. Moore, he brought it to the ultimate, what we call in logic, reductio ad absurdum, reducing the argument to its ultimate and logical yet absurd conclusion. He said, the only alternative to evolution is the doctrine of special creation, which may be true, but is irrational. You got to ask the question, how can the truth be irrational? If the truth is irrational, how can we have any kind of intelligent or logical discussion about anything? Since, after all, anything we discuss that might be truth is also irrational. And why waste the time? Basically, the truth is that which exists as reality. That which exists as reality is simply the truth. How can that which exists as reality somehow be irrational? The only answer I can find is only a philosophical bias is given more importance than truth. But here we're supposed to be dealing with science. Science is supposed to have the upper hand. What we can prove by repeated experimentation and observation under controlled conditions, in a laboratory preferably, that's supposed to reign. But here we have seen over and over again, science has little to do with why some of the most eminent evolutionists in history have rejected creation out of hand. It doesn't fit their bias. And if they have to, they'll even say truth is irrational, because if that's the real truth, they don't want it. Much like the Jews said about Jesus, we will not have this man to reign over us. We don't care if he can walk on water, change the water to wine, raise the dead. We don't care. We don't like him. He's not the kind of Messiah we want. And many evolutionists say, well, it may be true, but we don't want it. We will therefore call it irrational and proclaim ourselves the victors because we're rational, we're scientific by definition. What a charade. What a sad thing. Now, is there a double standard regarding intelligent design? I think so. You know, if an archaeologist dug up clay tablets in the Middle East with the Gilgamesh epic written down in beautiful cuneiform, and he brought this in and said, oh my goodness, look at this ancient epic story of this great flood. Wow, boy, a society that was really, gifted in literature and writing produced this. Well, there'd be no brouhaha about that. Everybody would accept, certain types of design like that don't happen by wind and rain and erosion on clay. Doesn't produce the Gilgamesh epic in cuneiform. Doesn't happen, at least not in our scientific experience. But that same argument is what the creationists use. The type of design, and particularly the linguistic complexity we find in all living organisms at the molecular level, information is the key to information storage and retrieval and actualization and utilization. It's all about information systems that interface with one another and cooperate with one another. And yet information is, based on everything we know in real science, something that only arises, as far as scientific observation is concerned, by intelligent authorship. Never by time, chance, natural laws of chemistry and physics. All the experiments have failed for more than half a century, since the landmark experiment of Stanley Miller in 1953. Yet, in spite of decades of abject failure, the evolutionists still are there, because in their book they can't lose. After all, the rule book says they win, even if all the evidence is against them. You have to understand that mindset, or you will get very frustrated in trying to converse with them. But say we have, this idea, well, you can't never invoke, intelligent design is by definition religion. It is by definition not science. Everything must be explained in terms of naturalism. So we tell our college students we're going to go out and look at this phenomenon. And before we go, remember the rule book says you can't invoke intelligent design and control procedures to explain this, okay? So then they take them out and they look at what? Mount Rushmore. Now they'd look at that and say, well, gee, 4 presidents' heads carved in granite. How did that get there? Based on everything we know in our life experience and in observation and science, they had to take that information, which we knew from eyewitnesses who drew portraits of Jefferson and Washington and actual photographs of Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, and they used that information to impose a precise facsimile or replica in granite at Mount Rushmore. That's the only way we know, based on any science, that that happens. It doesn't happen by wind and rain and erosion and squirrels burrowing into the rocks, at least not in our observation. But they know they want to get an A on the test. So they go, well, doesn't seem to make any sense, but I want to get my A, so I'm going to say, isn't it amazing what wind and rain and erosion for millions of years and squirrels burrowing in the rocks did? 4 presidents' heads in granite. That's the sad irony of what's going on. It's like, as one scientist called it, the elephant in the living room. The name of the elephant is intelligent design. And he said, you know, to make a living in the field of biochemistry, you have to live with the elephant in the living room, but you can never acknowledge it's there. It takes up space, it stinks, it defecates, it trumpets, it throws hay all over the place, and all the while we have to swear it's not there, because if we acknowledge it, we'll lose our job. The elephant in the living room is all over this universe. The fingerprints of the Creator are there. But many in the scientific community are intimidated and will never admit it. They'll go with the standard definition of naturalism. They want to keep their job. So we have a two-edged sword of science when it comes to the creation-evolution issue. And this, I quote Francisco J. Ayala, a very eminent evolutionist geneticist, and he said, a hypothesis is empirical or scientific only if it can be tested by experience. A hypothesis or theory which cannot be, at least in principle, falsified or proven false by empirical observations and experiments does not belong to the realm of science. And with glee, they exult and say, well, therefore, creation doesn't qualify as a scientific theory because we can't test it, we can't observe it, we can't call down the Creator and ask Him to do a miracle of creation for us. We can't go in the past and observe whether or not He did create the universe and life and man. And that's a legitimate criticism. We ultimately believe the doctrine of creation by faith. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't any evidence. I think there's a reasonable faith based on the weight of the evidence. That's how we make decisions in a court of law. The jury didn't see the crime happen, but they look at the weight of the evidence, and they judge that beyond reasonable doubt, this is true. Even though they didn't see it with their own eyes, the evidence is sufficient that it is a reasonable faith beyond reasonable doubt. And that's our faith in creation. We can say it's a reasonable faith. It fits the facts with the least number of problems and contradictions, and it is not contradicted by any known real facts of science. I'm not saying theories and philosophies. Lots of theories and philosophies in the world contradict the Bible, but they're just theories and philosophies, sometimes masquerading as scientific fact. Real, empirical, demonstrated facts, we don't disagree on at all. We have all the same evidence, all the same facts as the evolutionists. The only thing we disagree about is the interpretation, the history. How long it took, basically, is one of the big differences we disagree on. We look at the same physical evidence in every field of science. We just disagree on the history of how it came to be. Now, this double-edged sword cuts the other way because, although we can't prove creation by the scientific method, neither can we prove the evolutionary theory. Can we go back in a time machine and observe the Big Bang and the evolutionary origin of the universe, or the origin of the first living cell, or cell evolving into marine invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, apes, finally man, over billions of years of time? No, we can't observe it. And by his own definition, if you can't falsify it by observation, and we can't do that to evolution on the broad scale, because we can't repeat history in the laboratory, then it does not belong to the realm of science by their own definition. It's not a question of which one is faith and which one is scientific fact. It's a question of which faith fits the facts the best with the least number of problems and contradictions. That's the best we can do. With any historical question, science is limited in what it can tell us. Okay. Now I quote here L. Harrison Matthews, eminent British biologist, member of the Royal Society, a fellow of the Royal Society, actually they call them, and he was so eminent he was asked to write the introduction to the 1971 edition of Charles Darwin's famous book, The Origin of Species. They probably regretted asking him because he was a very honest scientist, and he said some amazing things, which I quote here. He said, "In accepting evolution as a fact, how many biologists pause to reflect that science is built upon theories that have been proved by experiment to be correct? Or remember that the theory of animal evolution has never been thus proved?" And in the broad scale, that's absolutely true. We can't see a family order class phyla change into another. Limited variation within distinct families, species, genus, yeah, we've seen that. Creation explains that, predicts that. But the big changes define Darwinian evolution, and no experiment has ever proved that it ever has or even could happen. He continues, saying, "The fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory." Oh, heresies in the halls of biology, but he's being honest about it. It's an unproved theory. It's not a fact. It is, he says, and this is a good question that ought to be asked in our textbooks. By the way, is it a science or a faith? Good question. Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. And neither will be in the ultimate scientific sense unless we can invent a time machine and literally go back and observe what really happened. We can't do that. Therefore, it's circumstantial evidence. Well, what does that mean? That means we have to compare the creation and evolution issues as scientific models rather than scientific theories. Okay? A scientific theory is a theory that can be put to the test and proven true or false. You can't do that in the broad scale with either creation or evolution. It's ultimately a matter of faith, but they can be examined as scientific models. Okay? A scientific model is simply a conceptual framework that's used to correlate and make predictions and correlate the evidence. And the model that can correlate the evidence with the least number of problems and contradictions and make predictions that fit the real world, then that theory is most likely the correct one. And that's where you have to leave it. This theory makes more sense. The weight of the evidence is with it. We therefore put our faith in that as being the most reasonable faith. That's the best we can do in this area. Now, when we define the creation-evolution controversy in the terms of models, conceptual frameworks, creation wins hands down. Evolution is contradicted by all kinds of known facts of chemistry and physics and experimental data. Contradiction upon contradiction upon contradiction. There aren't any facts that actually contradict the concept of special creation. Now notice predictions. Evolution predicts. And Julian Huxley said, indeed, the whole of reality is the self-transforming power of evolution, going to ever and ever greater levels of complexity. So from inanimate particles, we get complex biochemicals, which then organize into a living, reproducing cell. And that goes all the way up to man. And then supposedly man is continuing to evolve and is going up and up and up and up. Now, if this were true, we would predict that we ought to be able to find in nature some inherent intrinsic property of matter and energy that drives it to ever higher levels of complexity. No such intrinsic property of matter has ever been observed or proven. Thus, no law exists to describe this phenomenon. Exactly the opposite tendency of matter and energy has been observed over and over again without fail, so much so that it is embodied in a law. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of increasing disorder, increasing entropy, increasing loss of available free energy, converting into dilute, unavailable energy that, although it's there, it cannot be harnessed for useful work anymore. So, what we actually see in the real world, as defined in the second law, is something you would expect if creation is true. If creation took place, then an omnipotent creator created things perfect and complete. They didn't have to go on this upward progress to reach perfection. It was created with perfection at the beginning. Therefore, it couldn't go any higher than perfect. You wouldn't expect any higher upward movement like evolution predicts, and indeed we don't see that. However, things can go down from perfection, especially if the Creator, as He has revealed, has instituted a bondage of corruption and decay. Now, I don't think that means that God put the second law there at the time of the curse. I think the second law is there for a good reason. If we didn't have the second law in operation, certain chemical processes wouldn't work. We couldn't digest our food. That would be pretty miserable. Okay, talk about indigestion. Whoa. So you also wouldn't be able to walk without slipping and falling on your face, because as you walk, you generate heat, which dissipates according to the second law. You have to have friction. Without the second law, you wouldn't even be able to walk without slipping all over the place. So there's good reasons for that second law to be there, but the Bible says a bondage of corruption and decay. I believe there was an offsetting principle of God's providence there, as there was with the children of Israel. Remember, as they wandered in the desert 40 years, it said during all that time, their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out, and their feet didn't swell. Does that mean the second law wasn't there? No, I think it was there. It was just that God was offsetting its effects with his law of preservation, with his providence, his miraculous upholding of his sovereign purpose in that situation. I think when the curse came, God withdrew some of his providential grace, and this natural law was now a bondage, because there's no more an offsetting principle as there was for the children of Israel. So the law, I believe, has always been there, and the law is necessary, but degeneration is what we see. And that fits the idea of creation and a curse. And that is what we observe, and we never observe the opposite, which is necessary for evolution to be true on this broad scale, both universally and biologically. Now, the second law of thermodynamics sounds formidable, but it's something we're all too familiar with. Basically, the law of degeneration over time. With time, things tend to fall apart and go to pot. Our clothes wear out, our cars wear out, our houses wear out, we wear out, we get old and die. It may have a big name, but we're all too familiar with the bondage of corruption and decay formalized in the second law of thermodynamics. With time, things tend to go from a state of high free energy to loss of available free energy and entropy, and from complexity to disorder and simplicity. Now, the all-important thing, the implications of the laws of thermodynamics. Now, the second law is the law of increasing disorder, increasing loss of free energy, increasing entropy over time. Entropy being defined as randomness, disorder in a system, or dilute energy, the loss of free energy into dilute energy that's there, but it cannot be harnessed anymore. Now, the first law is the law of mass energy conservation. Thanks to Einstein, we know that matter is a kind of a form of energy, a kind of a coalesced energy. So it's all energy out there. But the first law says that no matter what happens, whether things blow up or burn down or things get transported, whatever reactions happen in the universe, the books always balance. You never have more energy at the end or less at the end of any transformation than you had before. There's always this conservation. The books balance, always the same